Summer, 1983. Pinto Island, Mobile, Alabama. Two detectives stood at the edge of a clearing, staring at freshly turned earth. The island stretched around them, 1,200 acres of marsh grass, scrub pine, and industrial decay. Behind them, the skeletal remains of the Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company rusted in the Gulf Coast humidity. Ahead, a backhoe sat silent, its bucket resting beside a hole that shouldn't exist. In that hole, partially exposed by the morning's excavation, was a human skull. The detective closest to the hole, a Mobile County Sheriff's Office investigator named Ray Jenkins, had been following rumors for 3 years. Whispers in bars, tips from informants, stories told by men who claimed to know where bodies were buried. And now, on this isolated island where ships were once built and launched into Mobile Bay, he was staring at proof. The skull was weathered, brown with age and soil. Beside it, caught in the dirt, was a woman's bracelet. Gold, tarnished, with a broken clasp. Jenkins looked at his partner. "Get the coroner," he said, "and tell them to bring a team. There's more down there." He was right. Pinto Island sits in Mobile Bay, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. For most of the 20th century, it was known for one thing: shipbuilding. The Alabama Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company, ADDSCO, had operated there since 1917, employing thousands of workers who built destroyers, cargo ships, and tankers for 2 world wars and the conflicts that followed. The shipyard was the economic heart of Mobile, a sprawling industrial complex of dry docks, cranes, and fabrication shops that ran 24 hours a day during wartime. But by the 1980s, ADDSCO was struggling. Foreign competition and mismanagement had battered the company. Layoffs came in waves. The workforce shrank from thousands to hundreds. Portions of the island sat abandoned, overgrown with vegetation, reclaimed by nature. The dry docks filled with stagnant water. The buildings became homes for rats and squatters. And in the abandoned sections of the island, away from the remaining workers and the roads that still saw occasional traffic, someone had been digging graves. The Gulf Coast in the 1970s and 1980s was a crossroads of American crime. New Orleans lay 90 miles to the west, a city controlled by the Martello crime family since the 1940s. Carlos Martello, a Sicilian immigrant who had risen to become one of the most powerful mobsters in the South, ran an empire that stretched from Louisiana to Florida. Gambling, prostitution, drug trafficking, labor racketeering, Marcello's organization touched everything. But Marcello was not the only power in the region. Operating alongside and sometimes in competition with the traditional Italian-American mafia was a looser, more chaotic network of criminals known as the Dixie Mafia. They were not a single organization. They had no formal hierarchy, no commission, no rules of succession. They were a collection of Southern outlaws, con men, drug dealers, and killers who worked together when it suited them and murdered each other when it didn't. The Dixie Mafia operated in the shadows of the Deep South, in small towns and rural counties where law enforcement was underfunded, corrupt, or simply overwhelmed. They ran illegal gambling operations in Mississippi. They trafficked marijuana and cocaine through Florida. They intimidated witnesses, bribed officials, and killed anyone who threatened their interests. And when they needed to dispose of a body, investigators would later believe, they looked for places like Pinto Island. The excavation continued for 3 days. Forensic teams worked in the oppressive Gulf Coast heat, sifting through soil, documenting evidence, cataloging remains. The initial grave yielded 2 bodies. Then a second grave was discovered 30 feet away. Then a third. By the end of the first week, investigators had found the remains of at least 6 individuals. Some were nearly complete skeletons. Others were fragmentary, scattered bones, partial skulls, teeth. The bodies had been buried at different times, some years apart. The graves were shallow, hastily dug, covered with minimal effort. Whoever put them there had not expected them to be found. With the bodies came artifacts: a woman's ring, a man's watch, the crystal shattered, the hands frozen at 3:47. Fragments of clothing, mostly decayed but occasionally preserved enough to reveal color or texture. Shell casings, .22 caliber, a round sometimes preferred by contract killers for its tendency to ricochet internally rather than exit the skull. maximizing damage to the brain. Zip ties, duct tape, the implements of abduction and murder. The coroner's office worked to identify the remains, dental records, missing persons reports, comparisons with descriptions of individuals who had vanished from Mobile, New Orleans, Biloxi, Pensacola. The Gulf Coast had no shortage of disappearances. People vanished regularly, victims of domestic violence, runaways, addicts, and occasionally, targets of organized crime. One of the bodies was identified as a man named Robert Hayes, a small-time drug dealer from Mobile who had disappeared in 1978. Hayes had been involved in marijuana smuggling, moving product from Florida to Alabama, paying tribute to larger organizations for the privilege of operating in their territory. According to informants, Hayes had made a critical mistake. He had held back money, skimming from the shipments, pocketing profits that belonged to someone else. He was last seen leaving a bar on Government Street in downtown Mobile. Two men had approached him in the parking lot. Witnesses saw Hayes get into a car, not willingly, but not fighting either. The kind of compliance that comes from recognizing the men, from knowing that resistance would make things worse. His body turned up on Pinto Island 5 years later, a bullet hole in the back of his skull. Another set of remains belonged to a woman named Linda Parsons, a prostitute who had worked the truck stops along Interstate 10. Parsons had been reported missing by her mother in 1979. She was 23 years old. According to investigators, Parsons had been involved with members of the Dixie Mafia, serving not just as a prostitute, but as a courier, carrying messages and packages between Mobile and New Orleans. At some point, she had become a liability. Perhaps she knew too much. Perhaps she had threatened to talk to police. Perhaps she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her remains were identified by dental records. A gold tooth in her upper jaw matched the description in her missing persons file. She had been buried wearing the clothes she disappeared in, a denim jacket, blue jeans, platform shoes that were fashionable in the late 1970s. The other bodies remained unidentified. They became John Does and Jane Does, stored in evidence rooms, waiting for families who might never come forward, waiting for technology that might one day reveal their names. The investigation expanded. Detectives from the Mobile County Sheriff's Office interviewed hundreds of people. They pulled in informants, offered deals, applied pressure. They wanted names. Who had done the killing? Who had chosen Pinto Island as a dumping ground? Who had the access, the knowledge, the audacity to bury bodies on an island that, while isolated, still housed an active shipyard with workers coming and going every day? The answers that came back pointed in multiple directions. Some informants blamed the Dixie Mafia, specifically a crew operating out of Biloxi, Mississippi, led by a man named Kirksey Nix. Nix was a convicted murderer who, even while serving a life sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, continued to run criminal operations on the outside. He communicated through intermediaries, through corrupt guards, through a network of associates who followed his orders without question. In 1987, he would be convicted of ordering the murder of a Mississippi judge and his wife, cementing his reputation as one of the most dangerous men in the Dixie Mafia. Nix had connections throughout the Gulf Coast. He had money in casinos, in strip clubs, in drug operations. And he had a reputation for eliminating problems, permanently. Other informants pointed to the New Orleans Mafia, to associates of Carlos Marcello who operated in the Mobile area. Marcello himself, by the early 1980s, was in decline. He had been convicted of bribery and racketeering in 1981 and was serving a 10-year sentence. But his organization continued to function. His underbosses and capos maintained operations, collecting debts, enforcing discipline, protecting territory. Mobile, sitting on the border between Louisiana and Alabama, was a contested space. Investigators believed both the traditional mafia and the Dixie Mafia operated there. Sometimes they cooperated, sharing profits and information. Sometimes they clashed, competing for control of gambling operations, drug routes, labor unions. And when they clashed, people died. Pinto Island, with its isolation and its industrial decay, was the perfect place to hide those deaths. The island was large enough that bodies could be scattered across multiple locations. It was accessible by car via the causeway, making it easy to transport victims without the complications of boats or water disposal. And it was owned by a private company, ADDSCO, which meant that outside law enforcement rarely ventured there without cause. The workers at ADDSCO, for their part, claimed ignorance. They worked in the active sections of the shipyard, near the docks and fabrication shops. The abandoned sections, where the graves were found, were off-limits, dangerous with rusted machinery and unstable structures. No one went there, or at least no one admitted to going there. But someone had known. Someone had chosen those specific spots, had driven vehicles across the island in the middle of the night, had dug graves and covered them and driven away, confident that the bodies would remain hidden. The investigation hit obstacles at every turn. Witnesses recanted. Informants went silent. Evidence was circumstantial. A body here, a rumor there, but no clear chain connecting a specific person to a specific murder. Defense attorneys would argue reasonable doubt. Prosecutors would struggle to prove intent, to place suspects at the scene, to overcome the passage of time and the degradation of evidence. Years passed. The graves on Pinto Island became a footnote in Mobile's criminal history, a story told in bars and newsrooms but rarely in courtrooms. The bodies were buried again, this time properly, in marked graves or released to families when possible. The excavation sites were filled in. The island continued its transformation. Carlos Marcelo died in 1993, having served his sentence and returned to New Orleans, where he lived out his final years suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He took his secrets to the grave, buried in Metairie Cemetery alongside other New Orleans notables. Kirksey Nix remained in prison, serving his life sentence. Although he was later convicted again in 2005 for running a massive extortion and fraud scheme from inside the prison, cementing his reputation for never abandoning his criminal empire, he maintained his silence about events from decades past. The men who might have done the actual killing, the triggermen, the enforcers, the soldiers who followed orders and disposed of bodies, either died themselves, went to prison for other crimes, or disappeared into the anonymity of time. No one was ever convicted for the murders tied to Pinto Island. The investigation revealed the graveyard, identified some of the victims, and generated hundreds of pages of reports and testimony, but it produced no trials, no convictions, no justice for the families of the dead. Why? The reasons are complex, rooted in the nature of organized crime in the Gulf Coast during that era. The criminals operated in a world of silence and intimidation. Witnesses who talked disappeared or recanted. Physical evidence was minimal. These were not sophisticated killings with elaborate forensics. They were executions, brutal and efficient, designed to leave as little trace as possible. The jurisdictional complications didn't help. Bodies found in Alabama, victims from Louisiana and Mississippi, suspects operating across state lines. Federal authorities could have taken the lead, but the FBI in the early 1980s was focused on larger targets: the 5 families in New York, the Chicago outfit, Colombian drug cartels. A handful of bodies in Alabama, tied to a loose network of Southern criminals, did not warrant the resources required for a major investigation. And then there was the corruption. The Gulf Coast in the 1970s and 1980s was rife with it. Police officers on the payroll of the Dixie Mafia, judges who accepted bribes, prosecutors who looked the other way. Not every official was corrupt. Men like Detective Ray Jenkins worked the case honestly, passionately, knowing they were fighting an uphill battle. But enough were compromised that the investigation was hobbled from the start. Evidence disappeared, files went missing. Witnesses who agreed to talk changed their minds after visits from men in expensive cars. The system, designed to deliver justice, was undermined by the very corruption it was meant to combat. Today, Pinto Island has changed. ADDSCO's parent company struggled through the 1990s, and the shipyard changed hands multiple times. Atlantic Marine took over operations, followed by BAE Systems. The scale of shipbuilding and repair work diminished dramatically from the yard's wartime peak, but the industrial legacy continued, transformed and reduced, but not entirely extinguished. Portions of the island became industrial parks. Portions remained abandoned, too contaminated or too expensive to remediate. The graves are gone, filled in decades ago. There are no markers, no memorials. Most people who live and work on the island today have no idea what lies beneath the soil. The history is forgotten, erased by time and development. But the story endures. In Mobile, among those who remember the 1980s, the Pinto Island graves are still discussed. Old-timers recall the excavation, the news reports, the sense of horror that gripped the city when the truth emerged. Younger residents, hearing the story for the first time, are shocked that such things happened here, in their city, on an island they drive past every day. The families of the victims, those who were identified, carry their grief silently. Robert Hayes's mother died in 1995, never seeing anyone punished for her son's murder. Linda Parsons' family held a funeral when her remains were released, but the closure was incomplete. Knowing what happened is not the same as knowing justice was served. For the unidentified victims, there is only silence. They remain Jane Does and John Does, stored in evidence, waiting. DNA technology has advanced since the 1980s. Perhaps one day a genetic match will give them their names back. Perhaps a family will finally learn what happened to a brother, a sister, a parent who disappeared decades ago. But the men who investigators believe killed them, who drove them to Pinto Island and put bullets in their heads and buried them in shallow graves, those men were never brought to justice. Some are dead. Some remain imprisoned for other crimes. Some may still be alive, old men carrying secrets they will never reveal. The Pinto Island graves represent a peculiar kind of crime, one that thrived in the gaps and shadows of American law enforcement. Organized crime in the Gulf Coast was not centralized like New York or Chicago. It was diffuse, opportunistic, violent. It exploited the vastness of the region, the weak points in the system, the corruption and indifference that allowed it to operate with impunity. The graves also represent a failure of law enforcement, of the justice system, of society. 6 bodies, maybe more, buried and forgotten. Families left without answers. Killers who lived free, who perhaps even bragged about their crimes in private, knowing they would never be held accountable. There is a bitter irony in the location. Pinto Island, a place where men once built ships to defend the nation, to carry cargo and soldiers across oceans, became what investigators believe was a graveyard for victims of organized crime. The same isolation that made it perfect for shipbuilding made it perfect for murder. Detective Ray Jenkins, the man who stood at the edge of that first grave in 1983, retired from the Mobile County Sheriff's Office in 1998. In interviews conducted years later, he spoke about the Pinto Island case with frustration and regret. He had done everything right, followed leads, gathered evidence, built a case. But the system had failed him. The witnesses recanted. The evidence was circumstantial. The suspects disappeared. "We knew who did it," Jenkins said in a 2005 interview with a local newspaper. "We just couldn't prove it. Not in a way that would hold up in court. And that's the hardest thing, knowing the truth and not being able to act on it." He died in 2010. The Pinto Island case file, thick with reports and photographs and witness statements, sits in a storage facility in Mobile, gathering dust, waiting for someone to reopen it, to take another look, to try one more time. But the chances of that happening grow slimmer every year. The witnesses are dying. The suspects are dying. The institutional memory is fading. Soon, no one will be left who remembers the excavation, the bodies, the gold bracelet caught in the dirt. The island will move on. Buildings will rise where the graves once were. Workers will arrive each morning, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Life will continue, indifferent to the dead. But the story remains. It exists in the files, in the memories of those who remember, in the narratives passed down through generations of Mobile residents. It serves as a reminder that evil is not abstract, not distant. It happens here, in places we know, on islands we drive past, in cities we call home. The Pinto Island graves are a wound that never healed, a crime that was never punished, a mystery that was never fully solved. And in that incompleteness lies the true horror. Not just what happened, but what didn't. The justice that never came. The answers that remain hidden. The accountability that was never enforced. Somewhere, perhaps, records exist that could break the case open. A confession recorded but never used. A witness who never came forward. Evidence that was overlooked or dismissed. Or perhaps there is nothing left. Perhaps the truth died with some of the men involved in those murders, and all that remains is the memory of graves on an island, and the knowledge that some crimes, some killers, slip through the cracks and disappear into history. Pinto Island stands as a monument to those failures. Not in stone or bronze, but in absence. In the graves that were filled in the names that were never learned, in the justice that never arrived. The island remembers, even if no one else does.